The other day I put together a video kind of detailing all the modifications I've done to the Cadillac here, but I think I failed to mention that I had never actually been able to do like a full pull with it, either with the carburetor or with the fuel injection. The carburetor I never got squared away as far as the tune and the AFRs I was seeing under boost, so I was hesitant to give it all the beans. And then once I swapped on the fuel injection, I seemed to develop an overheating problem. It overheats running down the road, and even setting idling it'll tend to run upwards of 230 plus. I never let it get past that, but it didn't seem to be wanting to cool off, even if, like with a lot of older vehicles, older V8s anyways, you could throw them in neutral and rev it up for a bit and get a little extra airflow through the radiator without a lot of load on the engine, and cool it off, you know, in a pinch. But it didn't seem to want to do that. So I think there are several different factors that I may be dealing with. One, the fuel injection kit or system. If you want it to control the ignition, you have to lock out the distributor and set it at a certain advance, and then you tell the ECU that your distributor sits at a certain advance and it works from that point. Now, many years ago anyways, I had entertained the idea of putting a centrifugal supercharger on here, and since the aftermarket doesn't have a whole lot of options as far as that goes, probably zero options as far as a centrifugal supercharger in a Cadillac, I decided I would cut my own balancer. It's not really a balancer because the Cadillacs are internally balanced, but a new pulley. I cut a new pulley, and it's a lot like the one on the Datsun, where you have the V-belt shiv to drive the alternator and the power steering pump, and then because there's enough room in there, I cut my own serpentine belt 6-rib pattern in the pulley itself. So as such, I lost basically the timing marks that would have existed on the old pulley, and I kind of half-assed it. Doing what I did was took this bit from a cam degree kit, and all it is this guy here threads into where the spark plug goes. You seat it in there, and then you have this insert that goes down in there, and once you put it down in there far enough, as you rotate the engine around, you will mechanically come up against this bolt. And what you do is, when you do come up against that bolt, you mark where your balancer or pulley is, and then you actually back the engine around until it hits this mechanical stop again, by hand, not with the starter, because you'll cause damage any other way. But you wind it around back till it contacts the starter, and you mark that point, and halfway between those two marks is top dead center, right? Because your piston's trying to come up, you stop it at one point, go back around, and it stops it at the next point. So in between the two marks is your top dead center. And I wasn't wasn't quite scientific in my approach or terribly accurate, so it was kind of a scientific approach coupled with an eyeball as far as getting the distributor set where I told the ECU it was at. So maybe my overheating is due to incorrect timing. A lot of times not enough advance will cause overheating for a number of reasons. I haven't seen, a lot of times with not enough advance, you'll see a whole lot of heat in the exhaust sides. The Fury that I built at one point, it wasn't running enough advance at cruising speeds, so it would put a whole lot of, basically the fuel's still burning when the exhaust valve opens up. So I was seeing red hot exhaust pipes, and actually the hot side of the turbos would be glowing when I got home, and it was just my failing to tune the ECU for that bit of the timing curve, really. But so we're going to address the distributor position, get it to where I'm more confident that we are at the crank position when I tell the ECU that we're at this crank position, plus the fact that this radiator and the water pump and our fan clutch, since they are repairs notwithstanding, all basically getting on to basically 50 years old. I may try and do a bit of a flush on the block once I get a bunch of this stuff cleared out of the way, so I have access to the ports through the block there. Try a bit of a flush. I don't know how much sediment has accumulated in the block over the years. It's probably not enough to cause the overheating situation that I'm looking at, because you can half fill a block with concrete or block filler and still run on the street. So I'm hoping that possibly the old fuel pump or the old water pump is, maybe the impeller has come free of the shaft, so we're not getting as much or any flow through the block, or our old radiator is clogged up with sediment. That's what I'm hoping for. So any of these 4 different items will hopefully cure my hot running issue. So when I did experience the overheating once I swapped on the fuel injection system, I did try a couple different things, maybe thinking that the thermostat was stuck. I put a new cooler thermostat in there and didn't change anything. I even went as far as pulling the thermostat out entirely, and it still wanted to run hot. I mean, an engine without a thermostat, generally will run very cool, but this one was still climbing up well past 200, and I'm just wasn't comfortable with that. Obviously something else is amiss. So one thing I've kind of recently noticed is this high spot in the upper coolant hose, which actually, back when the AC was on this car, the AC compressor actually fit up in this area here. There's doesn't look to be enough space for it as it sits now, but the old manifold was a whole lot lower and the distributor was clocked differently, so the body of the compressor actually set back in there underneath the hose in order to hit the belts there. So we've got this high spot in the hose, and I'll probably just cut this hose down so it's all a whole lot lower in order to avoid air being collected in this high spot here, and allow me to flush it through when I do refill the coolant system. You can see my homebrewed pulley, crank pulley down there. You got the alternator groove, and then the rear groove is for the power steering pump. But with the space, you'll be able to see it a lot clearer once I pull out a bunch of this charge piping and the associated mess. But it would have allowed me to run a belt up, much like the Datsun, behind the fan pulley or the water pump pulley, and locate the supercharger pulley here roughly. Obviously it would have been probably necessitating a completely different radiator hose in order to set that old body of the supercharger in here, but never quite got that far. I did cut the pulley, but just never got to put it into use. So we're going to pull most of the charge piping here. There's a couple things, like I said before, this fuel pump here needs some rerouting in order to set it down underneath this filter, just because I didn't have the appropriate fittings to make that happen at the time, and I just kind of wanted to get it up and running with the fuel injection set up. So we're going to pull a bunch of stuff here, pull the radiator, and pull the water pump, because like I said, it's, without knowing for sure, it could very well be nearly 50 years old. I've got this new flow cooler unit, which is supposed to flow 30% more coolant, and as with so many nice performance parts, all the bright shiny stuff is gets covered up once you bolt it on. But once we get everything out of the way and I pull that water pump, the easiest, most fortunate outcome would be that the impeller on the old water pump is slipping to where it's not giving us the flow that we need to keep the engine cool. But we'll see. And since the old radiator is as old as it is, I went and got myself an aluminum replacement. It isn't supposed to be a direct replacement because if anybody has tried to buy a direct replacement for their vehicle, you'll find that they're probably at least 50% more, if not twice as much, as just a generic, appropriately sized radiator. This one I did go with the transmission cooler ports instead of running a separate cooler for the transmission. But even still, I think I might have paid around 300 bucks, but if this was a direct replacement for a 72 Cadillac, you'd probably be looking in the neighborhood of $600 to $700 for an aluminum. I believe it's a 4-core with the transmission cooler built into it. They just go up in price a whole lot more when it's an OEM replacement. So the old digital camera let me down. It cut off well before I was done with the whole disassembly, just so I could do a neat little time lapse of that. But as you can see, I've got the fan, the water pump out, all my belts off. I've just disconnected the transmission cooler lines from the radiator, and I'm letting them leak down onto the floor for right now before I go ahead and pull the old radiator. You can see my home-brewed little pulley, crank pulley here. This, as I said before, this is the power steering groove. This is the alternator groove. And because I wasn't running the AC, let's see, I think the old power steering groove also had the AC running on it. But this is what would have been my six groove serpentine pulley spot. And you can see my alternator groove may be a little bit deep because you can see maybe some belt slippage there in the very bottom of it, but not worried. It'll probably work either way. One of the interesting things with these Cadillacs here is that, like any other water pump that I've dealt with, either bolts to a machined receptacle, for lack of a better word. But what the Cadillac has here is the old one was carbon steel. I picked this up when I did the engine swap, but it's a stainless just piece of sheet metal that's cut out, and it is basically the timing cover, and it holds the crank seal in it, but the water pump, that's all that it seals to, where most of your water pumps are a machined aluminum housing. This one just lays on the face of this piece of sheet metal here. I don't know if it's quite thick enough to call it a piece of plate, but this sheet metal, and then it just has some tapped ports that help seal it, and then obviously the bolted portions closer to the ports that go into the block itself. But just one of those Cadillac peculiarities that I've run across. So hopefully you can see the piston stop that I have in the spark plug hole there. let's see, in case you don't know what I'm talking about, it's just this guy right here, and like I was talking about before, it's just got an insert that threads in where the spark plug, or that has the spark plug thread. So it threads in there, and then you thread the stop in there a ways. And at this point, we've got the piston setting up against the stop, and I'm going to make a mark on my fabricated pull this out, pulley. And where before, because everything was installed as far as the charge piping, the water pump, all the belts and whatnot, I wasn't able to have access to the timing marks on the stock indicator here. So I was doing it all from down below and didn't have the benefit of these more precise marks here. So what we'll do is we'll mark it at 0, even though we're not sitting at 0. So I think we'll call this, oh, my marker isn't working. That might be a fine enough point. Yeah. So we'll mark 0 here. Close. Middle of the big smudge on the pulley. And then all we do is we run it backwards until our stop stops the piston. And I got all the other spark plugs in, so we're going to be fighting some amount of compression on the way around, but I think we hit the mark right there. So we will make another mark at 0 here. And you can see my other mark down here was on the other side of the piston coming up. So between these two marks is our true top dead center, and then we can proceed from there and get a correct timing adjustment for our distributor, and actually make a couple marks so that as the engine's running, I can shine a timing light in there and actually see true numbers as opposed to just a wag, if you will. I'll have to grab myself a tape. I'll back that stop off and rotate our marks to the top so that I can put a tape on there and make an accurate center mark, and then I think I'll actually punch it in a couple spots so that it's easier to see when the engine's running and the timing light shining on it. I've rotated the pulley back to where it's easily accessible, and these are my two marks where the piston stopped the engine on either side of the rotation, and I've marked it on my handy piece of paper here. Mark either spot, and then all I did was fold it in half, match up the marks, and then put a mark in the center of the boat of each of them. And then we'll just throw this back on here as closely as we can. And then we'll transfer our center mark. And this spot on the pulley forevermore is top dead center. And hopefully nothing moves around on us to throw off that measurement. I'm going to grab a hammer, and I've got a chisel. I'm going to lay it on there and make myself a pretty good punch mark so that it's easily picked up by the timing light. And once I make that punch mark, I'll just sharpie the hell out of it so that it's easily seen. The new radiator fit so well, I had to double check that it wasn't an application specific radiator with the attendant transmission cooler lines. It's just a Summit unit, and it's got the part number here. I looked it up, and it's just probably a generic large radiator or replacement radiator for big cars from the late 60s and 70s, because that's all it specifies is Oldsmobile, Pontiac, Cadillac, and Buick, and Chevy. And it has, just some basic ports that apparently everybody at GM was using. So I've already got the transmission cooler lines started in there, so the thread pattern was the correct size for that. The overflow and the heater return line are both close enough to be good enough to use without having to cut more out of the core support. The only thing I did have to do is these saddles that are on the bottom end of the radiator, because the core is wider than the original radiator. I just ended up bending out the tab on the bottom, this side of it, and it sets down in them. The width is correct for the bottoms and these top retainers to be bolted up. They'll obviously have to be massaged a little bit to hold that extra width of the radiator, but not a big problem. This is probably one of the easiest radiator installs that I've come across, because generally they're either non-stock replacements that I put in that need new mounts and such in order to make them work. Like the Datsun was completely different from a stock radiator just because I needed the extra cooling. Oh, the Fury. The Fury was another one that I had to do some custom mounts on. But this one here is surprisingly without trouble. Well, we got our new water pump in. The new fan clutch is on. And I got the radiator covered up, but it went in nicely. I just had to modify the two bottom mounting holes on the intercooler because that thicker core on the radiator pushed the bottom back a little bit. But all in all, it's been fairly painless. It went and laid my fuel pump down. You remember it was sitting across here on top. Laid it down with some other fittings that I had bought for the specific intent of laying that pump down in there. It's still not very pretty, but at least it's not laying across the top with the leads close to the metal on this filter here. So we just got a couple belts to put on, hoses, and the charge piping, and maybe we'll fire this thing up, see if it holds all the fluids, and then maybe tomorrow morning see if it's going to keep cool. I ended up with, when I opened this back up, I hadn't ever put a thermostat back in it, and I had a 190 degree thermostat, which I don't generally run on any of my performance vehicles, but I generally try and find 160. Maybe eventually I'll put one in here, but 190 will do for now. The Cadillac seems to be holding a steady temperature with all the replacements we've made, the new water pump, the radiator, and the fan clutch. So I can't exactly pinpoint what the problem was. I've had it up and running, and I've seen as high as 210, but as soon as you give it a little gas and get the RPMs up, it drops straight away down to below 200. It remains to be seen just how effective all our repairs will be when we're cruising down the road, but with our new marks on the crank pulley, I've been able to set the timing on the distributor. It was probably, it might have been 6 or 7 degrees off, which is quite a bit when it comes to wide open throttle and then the offsets that you'll see under boost. In addition to the cooling stuff, I've had these turbo hot side blankets laying around for quite a while, and I just never put them on because I wasn't sure how far I was going to have to get into the old Cadillac to fix the cooling problems or the temperature problem. So I put those on. They don't fit quite as well as I had hoped, but they're better than a poke in the eye with a sharp stick. I've had this car running for off and on the last half hour, and I can lay my hand right up against that blanket so we don't have to worry about roasting this oil feed line. The other I actually rerouted to run off the backside. I originally had it running around here and kind of looped down below the turbine, but it ended up real close between the valve cover and this downpipe from the turbo. So in order to get that away from excessive heat, I just reversed my fitting here and then ran the tubing back around there. It still obviously is between the downpipe and the valve cover, but there's a lot more space, air space, between the two than I had before. Along with all the part replacements that I've done and a bit of timing correction that I've made, I made several changes to the ECU as far as base settings, AFRs for idle, cruising, and then wide open throttle, some of the offsets for the timing. I jumped up the idle because this thing will idle at about 500, 550 RPM, but stabbing it, the throttle from there presents problems, and then when you completely come off the throttle and it tries to return to that 550, it's inevitably going to have a little dip, and it fights that. So I jumped the idle up to 750, which is perfectly fine for this. It's not struggling to idle. So along with those changes, we've got some road work that needs to be done in order for the ECU to more accurately dial in the AFRs, specifically under just light load, cruising type stuff, and then eventually we'll get into boost, and even before that anyways, wide open throttle, just to see how the AFRs respond. One thing that I've noticed and maybe read a little bit about is that these throttle body fuel injection units don't necessarily like dual plane intakes. For whatever reason, it kind of messes with the fuel distribution on them. That remains to be seen. If it becomes something that can't be worked out, maybe we'll go with a really low single plane, although I don't know if anybody makes one for this engine that isn't going to put me into my hood, and I'm not going to cut a hole just to get a carb bonnet to sit on the fuel injection unit if the mounting position of a single plane is that much higher. Aside from all that, I'll get maybe put a few miles on it. It's getting on towards fall and possibly winter at any point. Not true winter, but snow on the ground, and this car isn't going to deal with that very well at all. So if you have any comments as to my method or suggestions as far as this setup is concerned, just drop me a comment, and we'll go from there.